Without further ado, if you want to open up your Bibles, we're going to be starting in Ezekiel chapter 38. Long-awaited teaching here that many of you have been looking forward to. Ezekiel 38 and 39, one of the most interesting prophecies, really, that is in the Bible that is yet to be fulfilled. A war in Israel that has been predicted for 2,600 years, but hasn't happened yet. And as we're going to see this morning, it is something that's going to take place in the latter days, in the end times, in the last days, which of course we've been studying on that subject here of living in the last days. It's been a study of prophecy, and we are going to continue to study through prophecy as we wrap up our expository study through 2 Peter. But this is sort of an expounding message, as it were, on prophecy, specifically on Ezekiel 38 and 39. We looked at Ezekiel 36 and 37 over the last couple of weeks, and so I encourage you to go back and listen to those messages if you were not here. They're all on our podcast, our YouTube channel, etc., and our information to find the addresses and so forth is on the back table there for our media information. And we also have a Facebook page, right? Do we have a Facebook page now, Viviana? Where's Viviana? Is our Facebook page up and running? Yes. Praise God. So, we appreciate everyone who participates in our social media. We have over 100 subscribers. I want to read Isaiah 44. If you would just turn to Ezekiel 38. I'm just going to read a couple of verses here in Isaiah 44 to kind of set the stage here this morning. Isaiah 44:6 says this: "Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God besides me. And who is like me? Let him proclaim and declare it. Yes, let him recount it to me in order, from the time that I established the ancient nation. And let them declare to them the things that are coming. Do not tremble and do not be afraid. Have I not long since announced it to you and declared it? And you are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? Or is there any rock? I know of none." And so God, speaking here through the prophet Isaiah, is saying, there's no one like me who could tell you the future before it happens. It is literally God's signature on the Bible that we know this is a supernatural, divinely inspired, God-breathed book. Because close to 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy. Some of it's already been fulfilled. Some of it is yet to be fulfilled. But there's no one that has written in the past that has accurately predicted the future. You know, they say Nostradamus predicted a lot of things. If you've actually ever read Nostradamus or studied Nostradamus, it is so weird and so strange and so convoluted, his visions that he had when he was in an occultic, drug-induced stupor, that it could mean whatever you want it to mean. You could make it mean whatever you want. I mean, if you're taking specific prophecies from Nostradamus, they say that less than 5%, you could be generous and give him 5% of his prophecies might have been correct about the future. That means he was wrong about 95% of what he predicted was going to happen. You see, and God has been correct about everything he has predicted that's going to happen. 100% right every time. And so God says, who's like me? Let him proclaim it and declare it. Let him recount it to me in order. In other words, let someone else directly tell you what's going to happen in order before it happens. Let him recount it to me in order. Let them declare to me the things that are coming and the events that are going to take place. And then he says, is there any other God besides me? I know of none. Because there is no other God besides Yahweh, besides Jehovah, besides Jesus Christ, who knows the end from the beginning and tells us the future before it happens. And it's one of the evidences, one of the strongest evidences for the inspiration of the Scriptures, that this is a divinely inspired book. Jesus said, I have told you these things in advance, so that when they take place or when they come to pass, you will believe. And that is the point of prophecy. God's telling us the future in advance so that as these things happen, we will then believe in the gospel. We'll believe in the promises in the Word of God. Because if the prophecies are true, the rest of it is true. So again, back to Ezekiel chapter 38. This is going to take me a couple of weeks to get through Ezekiel 38 and 39. So this morning is going to be somewhat of an introduction to these two chapters and the content that is contained here. Our series is entitled The Promise of His Coming. And this is specifically related to a future war that is yet to come between Israel, Iran, and Russia. Those are facts that we know for sure. There's a lot in here that is subjective and that people have different opinions on who they are, what nations these are, what this means, and so forth. But there's certain things that we're going to see here in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that are definitive, that are clear, that are undeniable. And those are a couple of things that are undeniable. Israel's going to be restored back to their land in the last days, as we saw in Ezekiel 36 and 37. When they are dwelling securely, they are going to get attacked from the north, actually from all directions, the north, south, east, and west. It's kind of a confederacy of nations that attack Israel, but it's primarily from the north. And we know that Persia is leading the charge. That's modern-day Iran, and Russia, the furthest country to the north of Israel on a map. Those are things that are undeniable. Those are facts that are undeniable in this prophecy. This is going to seem somewhat like an Old Testament seminary theology class, and I apologize for that. I don't like to make things too academic, but sometimes you need to kind of be a little academic when you're dealing with subjects that need more depth and more explanation. So bear with me. You might want to listen to this message again if you want to catch everything, or you could take copious notes, but I would just say listen to it again, or just enjoy listening to what the Lord tells us here this morning. Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now, again, what I want to start with is the things that are definitive facts about this prophecy. There's much here that we could speculate about. And quite frankly, I don't have the time to speculate on all of the different questions that are here. It just wouldn't be really profitable. And quite frankly, we don't really know about some of these countries that are listed and so forth. So I want to stick to the things that are definitive facts that really we can just kind of build this teaching on. We know, first off, that this is going to take place in the last days. How do we know that? Because we're told that several times in this prophecy. For example, in verse 8, we read this. After many days you will be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely, all of them. Verse 9, And you will go up, and you will come like a storm, and you will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you. So chronologically, I would say that these two chapters are somewhat, in my understanding, parenthetical. It's like a parenthesis to where you could insert Ezekiel 38 and 39 in this prophecy somewhere into Ezekiel 37. Because Ezekiel 37 talks about the Jews coming back to their homeland, the dry bones coming back to life, as we looked at last week in some detail. The last couple of weeks, actually, we've been looking at this subject. And we know that in Ezekiel 37, it talks about the Messiah reigning, the king being there, which is Jesus. We see that there's going to be the Holy Spirit of God poured out upon the nation at that time. And we see that the sanctuary or the temple will be rebuilt. That's all in Ezekiel 37 toward the end of the chapter. This is, number one, David's not mentioned. The Messiah is not mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So we know that if the Messiah was there, he would be fighting for Israel in this war. He's not there yet. So again, it's parenthetical. It slips in between Ezekiel 37, toward the middle of the chapter and before you get to the end of the chapter, because the sanctuary is not rebuilt in Ezekiel 38 and 39. There's no temple mentioned. There's no holy place mentioned. There's no sacrifices mentioned. And the Messiah is not reigning. And so it's a parenthetical couple of chapters telling us about a future war in the last days after Israel is reborn as a nation and comes back into their land. They've been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. We looked at all of that last week and we saw that's exactly what happened when the Jews came back into their land. Malaria-infested swamps, denuded of trees, the land had been salted. It was a desert wasteland when the Jews began to come back in the early 1900s with Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement and so forth. And so we know that this is speaking of the last days. Generally, when the Bible talks about the last days, it's talking about the end times. It's talking about the times right before Jesus Christ returns, or when Jesus Christ returns, to set up his kingdom, his 1,000-year millennial reign. We know that it's going to be the last days after the Jews have been returned to their land, and we know that war is going to come upon them when they are living securely. Now, some people would say, well, Israel's not secure. Have you ever been to Israel? It's the safest nation in the world. In my opinion, I've traveled a lot of the world. Israel is safer than Bakersfield, to be quite frank with you. Israel is one of the safest places on earth. Not only because they have the greatest technology and they know everything that's going on all the time in their country, but because God watches over Israel. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, even though you may have, Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims who are threatening to come in from the East Gate, the Damascus Gate, and blow people up or stab people or shoot people, Jerusalem just feels safe. I mean, when you're there, you feel like this is a safe place. And it is a safe place. So when people say, well, Israel's not dwelling securely, travel to Israel and see how safe you feel over there. As a matter of fact, there was one story that one of my friends who's a pastor who leads tours to Israel, actually we went with him to Israel, he told us a story of a trip when he was there prior to taking us to the Holy Land, that one of his members, or one of the guys that came with them, did not follow the rules. He didn't stay in his hotel room. He wandered around East Jerusalem at 10 or 11 o'clock at night when he should have been sound asleep in his bed. And he went over and went toward the eastern gate, which is the Palestinian part of Jerusalem, or the part that the Palestinians claim as theirs, going into that area of the West Bank of Israel. And he went back to his room. There was no problems or anything like that. I think he got back to his room around 1 o'clock in the morning, but he didn't tell anybody, is the point. He didn't tell his tour guide. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing. He wasn't following the rules that had been given to him. And when they went to fly home, the Israeli security forces pulled him aside and took him into a private room. He missed his flight. And they asked him, what exactly were you doing on this night when you left your room at 10 o'clock and you came home at 1 and you went to the Eastern Gate, the Palestinian area, by yourself? Did you meet someone? Did somebody give you a package? Did you hand someone a note? And they grilled this guy for like 6 hours. They interrogated him. And so Israel knows what's going on. the Jews know what is happening in their land. They have technology. They have surveillance. They have unbelievable ways of keeping track of what's happening. In the end, the guy was just not smart. He made a really unwise decision, and he had to catch a different flight, and he didn't get to travel home with his companions and so forth. But, he got the message. You follow the rules when you're in Israel, in Jerusalem. So, and that was many years ago that this happened. And so, I would say that Israel is a very secure place. The Jews feel very secure in their homeland. Very secure. And I think Christians who go as pilgrims also feel secure. That's my experience. Verse 15 gives us a little more detail about this war. And we read, "And you will come from your place out of the remote parts of the north, you and many nations or peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great assembly and a mighty army. And you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will come about in the last days that I shall bring you against my land, in order that the nations may know me, when I shall be sanctified through you before their eyes, O Gog." And so a second time the Lord tells us when this is going to happen. It's going to be in the last days. So this prophecy was written by the prophet Ezekiel in approximately 575 BC, 575 years before the birth of Christ. So we're talking almost 2,600 years ago. God gave this prophecy to Ezekiel, but God said it's going to happen in the last days, at the end times. And truly, if you have studied the nation of Israel, the history of the nation of Israel, there is no war that has ever happened with these nations that have come in this way to attack Israel, as is described. And this is a very detailed description of this war, 2 chapters long. And, God is telling us in advance what is happening. Now, this is still future for us. It's been 2,600 years since this was prophesied to happen. It still hasn't happened. It's still future for us. But we're certainly 2,600 years closer to its fulfillment than Ezekiel was as he wrote this prophecy. So we read there that they're going to come from the remotest parts of the north, this invading army primarily, the remotest parts of the north. And if you look at a map of Israel, and according to God, Israel is the center of the world. If you take a flat map and you look at Israel, it's right smack dab in the center of the flat map world. And from God's perspective, Israel is the apple of God's eye. Israel is the center of the world. Jerusalem is the center of Israel. The temple is the center of Jerusalem, and the holy place is the center of the temple. So everything is centered there in Israel, in the eternal city of Jerusalem, from God's perspective. So we have to see it that way. When you look at a map and you go directly north of Israel, on a map, you can go and do this after church. I'll give you a homework assignment. You could see it for yourself. You look directly north of Israel and you go to the furthest nation, the furthest place where there are people inhabiting, not the North Pole where there's no people and there's polar bears. That's too far north. There can't be an army from the North Pole. So you come back before the North Pole, and where are you? You are in Russia. Russia. And so God is giving us some boundaries. He's given us some descriptions of He's not calling Russia out 2,600 years ago. Some people think He is. The Prince of Rosh, they think that means Russia. Meshach, they think that means Moscow. That's a linguistic stretch. I don't believe that's exactly what God is saying linguistically. But He's telling us where this army is going to come from, where this invading army is going to come from. It's going to come from the furthest north part, directly from Israel. As you go north as a crow flies, far north as you could go, you're in Russia. And that's where this invading army is going to come from. So God is giving us some specific details. We also know that part of this invading army is going to come from Persia. In verse 5, we read, Persia, Ethiopia, and put with them all of them with shield and Homer, Gomer with its troops, Togarmah from the remotest parts of the north with its troops, many peoples with you. Persia is modern day Iran. Interesting. Has Iran been in the news recently? Anybody heard of Iran in the news with military aspirations threatening the nation of Israel? Is that maybe happening today in our news cycle? Interesting about Persia is that this is modern day Iran, and I'll get into some more details about Persia in a minute, but Persia historically was an ally to the Jews. Persia was the friend of the Jews all the way until 1979, actually, when the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran, and the name was changed to Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have Iran today developing nuclear weapons. They have potentially a covert nuclear arsenal. Their stated purpose of developing nuclear weapons is what? To wipe the Jews off the map. Ahmadinejad was at least honest about it when he was the president. He said, we're doing this for one purpose, to drive the Jews into the sea, drive them into the Mediterranean Sea and take back that land for Allah, for Islam, because it is a thorn in the side of the Muslims that they have the Jews, their enemies, living right in the heart of the Middle East. And so they have a goal and they have a stated purpose of destroying the Jews and taking that land from them so that they can take it back for Allah and for Islam. And Iran is right now developing nuclear weapons, missile technology. It's all related to wiping out Israel. That's their whole purpose. We have now put embargoes against their oil. We have put sanctions upon them. The world government has put sanctions upon them because of their nuclear activities. They're continuing with their nuclear activities. And still they push ahead in spite of these embargoes and the economic pain that they are suffering because they're not legally allowed to sell their oil, and that is really the only thing that they have to export is their oil. You have Hezbollah, who is armed and trained by Iran. Hezbollah is a militant organization that really was founded in Lebanon. These are the Shiite Muslims, not the Sunnis. The Sunnis are Hamas. The Sunnis would be Saudi Arabia. And the Shiites and the Sunnis are always fighting each other, these two factions or divisions of Islam. But Hezbollah is Shiite, as Iran is Shiite, and Hezbollah has been beefed up, funded, trained, and armed to the teeth right on the border of Israel in Syria. Iran has used the civil war in Syria as an excuse and as a justification to build up Hezbollah right there on the border, the northern border of Israel. And Israel is very concerned about this. There are probably 100,000 missiles, Hezbollah missiles, pointing at Israel right now. At least that's what they know about. 100,000 missiles, all from Iran, transferred into Syria and into Lebanon to Hezbollah so that they can threaten Israel. So you have Hezbollah entrenched in Syria at the northern border, just past the Golan Heights in Israel. They are also based in Lebanon, another northern border of Israel, a nation that borders Israel. Hezbollah is well entrenched there, pretty much runs that country in Lebanon. They have the Houthi rebels in Yemen, that Iran has been funding a civil war in Yemen for 5 years. The Saudis have been funding the other side. It's a proxy war, really, between kind of America and Iran to some degree. Interesting that Russia's involved in that too on the Iranian side, coincidentally, right now. And the Iranians are threatening at this time to close the Strait of Hormuz, where the majority of the world's oil passes through on ships, through the Strait of Hormuz, over there off the coast of Saudi Arabia and that area in the Middle East. And so we just sent aircraft carriers and destroyers and troops. As a matter of fact, there was an article that I read in the Wall Street Journal I think it was just yesterday, and I'll share with you what is the latest news on this Iranian threat to close the Strait of Hormuz and what America is. America's certainly taking it very seriously, this threat. This was yesterday, May 25th, from the Wall Street Journal. It says, Iranian lawmaker downplays the risk of imminent war despite rising tensions between Tehran and Washington. Iran would be prepared to respond to a possible confrontation with the U.S. after the Trump administration dispatched troops to the region and arranged the sale of billions of dollars of weapons to its Arab allies, top Iranian officials have said. President Trump on Friday said he was sending 1,500 more troops to the Middle East amid rising tensions with Iran. On the same day, his administration invoked a rarely used provision of American arms control laws to declare an emergency to rush through weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and sidestep a U.S. Congress that may have objected to the deals. The moves have raised concerns within Iran that the U.S. could be preparing for a regional war, even as some powerful officials played down the prospect of an imminent conflict. Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, said Washington's decision to send 1,500 troops to the Middle East is dangerous and must be countered. In recent weeks, Iran's rivals have been targeting a number of attacks that have included the sabotage of oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. That's where we're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf. A rocket also landed inside the Baghdad's green zone, not far from the U.S. embassy. The strikes have caused little damage and no casualties. Iran has denied involvement in all of the attacks, but the incidents show how groups allied with Iran can heighten a conflict by provoking its rivals. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo earlier this month told Iraqi officials in Baghdad that the U.S. would strike inside Iran to retaliate for any attacks on its installations or personnel in Iraq, according to people briefed on official discussions. This is one more quote I want to give you in this article. Iran's most senior military leaders, however, have sounded warnings of a potential clash and regional fallout. Quote, America is sending 2 warships to the region. If they commit the slightest stupidity, we will send these ships to the bottom of the sea along with their crew and planes using 2 missiles or 2 new secret weapons, said General Mortezi Korbani, an advisor to Iran's military command, speaking to Mizan, the judiciary's news site. And so it goes on, the article goes on. But Iran is in the news. We are concerned. America is concerned. Our allies are concerned. There is the potential threat of war. We have sent naval vessels there as a deterrent. And yet the Iranians are stubbornly and determinedly continuing in their push to develop nuclear technology and nuclear weapons with the specific aim of destroying the nation of Israel. Interesting that Russia, the land the furthest to the north, again, if you take a map and you look the furthest to the north, the most remote part of the north, and you see Russia, they're going to be allied with Iran. Russia is also active in Syria, as you may be aware. They are there. They are entrenched. They are implanted in Syria. As a matter of fact, the dictator that's there would have been overthrown by now in Syria had Russia not stepped in a few years ago and beefed him up and supported him militarily. And so we see Russia there, right there on Israel's northern border in Syria. They are now allied with Iran. They're sharing military technology. They're training troops together. They're supporting each other for the first time, really, that we can look to. And they are on Israel's literal doorstep. Russia, Iran is motivated by religion to wipe out Israel because they hate the Jews. And Russia, not so much. Russia's more motivated by the promise of power and influence and perhaps tremendous wealth. If they ever, or when, we should say, they come and they attack Israel, it's not over some religious issue for the Russians as it is for the Iranians. It's because they want power and influence over the Middle East and control of the oil supplies of the world. And so it's just interesting that God predicted all of this 2,600 years ago, and we just happen to be living in likely the last days, certainly closer to the last days than any other people before us. And we see all the players in place, lined up, ready to go. Now, when will this happen? It's going to be in the biblical last days as we looked at. I don't know specifically exactly when it's going to happen. That's where you can get off into the weeds, theologically, and have so many different opinions of exactly when it's going to happen. We know the war hasn't happened yet. It's still future. There are those that believe this is going to happen immediately before the 7-year tribulation period. There are some who I respect greatly, although I disagree with, like J. Vernon McGee, who I respect greatly, but I disagree with him. He believes, as do many, that it's going to happen after 3.5 years of the tribulation period, and it's going to kick off the Great Tribulation period. That's a possibility. Some believe it's going to happen right before Christ comes back to the earth at the second coming. That would be at the end of the 7-year tribulation period. I don't believe that either. But some respected Bible scholars do believe that, prophecy teachers. And then some believe that it's going to be a war that's going to happen at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, when that final uprising takes place after Satan is bound for 1,000 years, then he's loosed, and he deceives the nations once again, and they lead armies to attack Jesus, and they attack Jesus Christ in Jerusalem and try and overthrow him. And I do not believe that that's when this war is going to happen. I happen to believe that this is going to happen immediately before the tribulation period begins. I could be wrong. With prophecy, you can't be too definitive on things where the Bible's not clear. There are certain things we can be very clear on. Those are the things I'm trying to communicate to you right now. Certain things are really undeniable. They're very clear. They're very specific. Other things we'll just have to wait and see. Ezekiel 39, skipping ahead, verse 29, at the end of the prophecy, God says this: as a result of this war that's going to take place and God defending his people Israel when they're just overwhelmed by this invading army, and God fights for them, God says this in Ezekiel 39:29, "And I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I shall have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the Lord." And so I personally believe that this war might very well happen simultaneously with the rapture of the church. That as the rapture of the church happens, there's going to be so much media focused on the Middle East about this war that's taking place. And as we're going to see, that God obliterates this invading army. Israel doesn't even have to fight. God fights for them like he did in ancient times, in biblical times, and wipes out their enemies. And then God is going to be restored to Israel. The Jews have been blinded for 2,000 years since the rejection of Christ. But God, as we've looked at throughout this study, is going to fulfill his covenantal promises to the nation of Israel. And their Messiah is going to come back. And Paul the Apostle says in Romans 11 that on that day, all of Israel will be saved. And so I believe at that point, God pivots. Instead of working in and through the church that is made up of Jews and Gentiles, God then pivots back to his covenant people, Israel, after this war takes place, because he says, I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. I'm going to pour my spirit out upon them, the literal, physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their historic, biblical homeland. Again, I could be wrong. We'll wait and see. But I see that that's how this war fits. And I think that it would also explain how the rapture could happen and the world not pay much attention to it, because the world will certainly be very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East, because that is the oil that drives the engine of the world's economies, all based right there in the Middle East. So back to chapter 38, verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now Gog is the name of somebody. We don't know who it is, but Gog is the name of somebody, likely the name of a king or the title of a king. Magog or Magog is the place of Gog, or the place of that king. So Gog is the name of somebody, a king. The land of Magog is the land of that king. He is called the prince or the chief of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And that phrase, the prince of Rosh, could literally be translated the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Again, I don't believe that this has any connection to the name linguistically meaning Russia and Moscow. I guess it could be, but I don't believe in my studies that that's what is taught. Literally, the name doesn't mean that, I don't think. But we know where these armies, this king is coming from. He's coming from due north of Israel, which is Russia. Either way, whether you believe it means Russia and Moscow, it certainly is the area of modern day Russia and probably the capital of Russia, Moscow. It's interesting, there are no other references or connections to these people in the Old Testament. So sometimes you could dig through the scriptures and you can go back and you could search and study words and so forth, and you could find other examples or other wars that these people fought, like we just talked about with Persia being Russia. We know who Persia is. But you can't find anything more about Gog or the land of Gog, which is Magog, in the Old Testament to identify who these people are exactly. Meshech and Tubal are peoples from the north of Israel. We know this. And historically, this is an area near the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Black Sea and the Caspian Sea are where Meshech and Tubal are most likely located, according to Bible scholars. They have never been a threat to Israel. Israel's had lots of enemies over the years. They've had continual war and lots of enemies for their whole history. But their enemies never came from this area before. Still not yet. They still haven't fought wars with people from the north like this, from Russia or from the places around the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea. They've never been a historic enemy to the Jews. Geographically, this is likely speaking of the countries in modern-day eastern Turkey, the southwest nations in the southwest of Russia, and the northwest of Iran. It is a very unusual confederacy because you see these nations that are listed, and it is most interesting to note which countries are not involved in attacking Israel. It's not who you would think it would be, actually. It's kind of surprising. You would think it would be Egypt. Egypt's not mentioned. My goodness, how many times has Israel fought against Egypt in their history? I mean, you go all the way back to the time of Joseph to see, and Moses to see Egypt, trying to oppress and annihilate through a genocide, to annihilate the Jews when they were there in Egypt for 400 years. And, the modern day wars that Israel has faced, Egypt has led the charge in the War of Independence against the Jews in 1948. This War of 67, the Six-Day War that came in 73, the Yom Kippur War, rather, that came in 1973. Egypt was a leader of the pack. Egypt's not mentioned here. Interesting, today, Egypt is one of Israel's allies. For 3,500 years, Egypt hasn't been an ally to Israel. They've been an enemy to Israel. But today they're an ally to Israel. As a matter of fact, today, Israel exports pretty much most of the natural gas from the Leviathan natural gas reserves that Israel discovered in the Mediterranean Sea recently, last few years. They are exporting natural gas into Egypt. So Egypt is partnering with Israel for their energy today. So it's interesting. God knows the future. He knew that Egypt was not going to be part of this alliance, this confederacy that's going to attack the Jews in this war. As a matter of fact, Assyria and Babylon are not mentioned. And modern-day Iraq is where ancient Assyria and Babylon were located. Nineveh and Babylon. That's all in modern-day Iraq on a map. They are not mentioned as coming with these armies to attack Israel. You would think they would be. They've been the enemies of the Jews. Again, Iraq was involved in attacking the Jews when they became a nation, May 14th, 1948. Iraq was involved in that attack against the Jews, that group of nations that came against them at that time. And yet Iraq is not mentioned here as being part of this attack against the Jews. And so it is interesting because right now Iraq is not a threat to Israel, and they won't be a threat to Israel in this war. All of this points to this being a prophecy that is very likely to be fulfilled soon. Now, soon could be in the next 100 years on a biblical time frame, but it is all the players are in place. The ones who are supposed to be there are there. The ones who aren't supposed to be there aren't there. And so this tells me that God is giving us indication that we are very close to this event happening. Verse 4 says, I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws. I will bring you about and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company, with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords. And so God is saying something here that is it's kind of unusual, this phrase, that I'm going to put hooks into your jaws and bring you against Israel. What that probably means is that Russia is not necessarily interested in Israel. They're not necessarily in Syria right now because they want to attack Israel. However, it's going to come about when this war happens that they're going to be committed, probably because of military agreements, military alliances that they have made with Iran, that they're going to get sucked into participating in this war. And again, Russia's interests are not religious, as Persia's interests will be religious. The furtherance of Islam against the God of the Jews, that's Iran, Persia's motive. Russia's not interested in that. They're really a communist atheist kind of a nation. And so there's going to be some other reason. But God is going to drag them into this war, put hooks in their jaws, bring you out. Ezekiel describes army, horses, and horsemen. Some people say, well, people don't ride horses into battle anymore. Well, they still could ride horses into battle if they wanted to. They rode horses into battle in World War II in some places. Certainly World War I was fought primarily with horses. That wasn't very long ago. But God is saying that they're going to be well armed and they're going to move quickly. That's what a horse would mean. Horsemen and a cavalry would mean that it's a quick attack. It's rapid. It's not a slow-moving army that's coming. It is going to happen speedily and quickly, and they're going to be armed to the teeth. Verse 5 says, Persia, Ethiopia, and put with them, all of them with shield and helmet. So we just talked about Persia. Persia today is modern-day Iran. If you would have looked at a map of the Middle East before they overthrew the Shah in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, the Ayatollah came in. Many of you remember it. and overthrew. As a matter of fact, Persia, before they became Iran, was one of the most secular, progressive nations in the Middle East. And they were not involved in the war against Israel in 1948. They were not involved in the war against Israel in 1967. They were not involved in the war against Israel in 1973. The three major wars that Israel has faced for their independence, for their very survival. Persia wasn't a part of it, because actually the Persians had always been historic allies to the Jews. They've never been their enemies in the past. If you look at the history of the relationship between Persia and Israel, Persia was a friend to Israel, actually, all the way up until 1979. They were one of the few countries there in the Middle East that actually supported Israel, or at least didn't oppose Israel when Israel became a nation again. Darius, you have King Darius of the Medes and the Persians, who was a hero to the Jews. You have Cyrus, who was a hero to the Jews, overthrew the Babylonians, allowed the Jews to come home after their 70-year captivity. 586 to 516 BC, the 70-year captivity of the Jews. It was the Persians who orchestrated the Jews returning back to their homeland. It was Queen Esther who was married to a Persian king, Xerxes. You remember. It was Nehemiah who was the cupbearer to the son or the grandson of Xerxes, Artaxerxes, who allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland and to rebuild their temple and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so the Persians have always been the supporters of the Jews. They've been the friends of the Jews up until now. And so it's all pointing to the fact that we are getting very, very close to this event happening. These other countries that are mentioned in verse 5, you have Persia, of course, which is Iran. You have Ethiopia, which some translations translate that word Cush, but it's modern-day Ethiopia. Ethiopia, although it is a democratic nation, Al-Shabaab, the Muslim terrorist group Al-Shabaab, has a tremendous stronghold in Ethiopia. And they attack the Christians in Kenya and Nairobi and so forth from Ethiopia and these areas that border some of these democratic Christian nations. You know, Ethiopia was at one time a Christian nation, but the Muslims have made a stronghold there in this day and age. And so armies are going to come, or troops from Ethiopia. Put is modern-day Libya, not a friend to the Jews. Modern-day Libya, very Islamic, very Muslim, very anti-Israel. And this was written before Allah was ever born. This was written 1,000 years before, Muhammad was ever born. And Allah created by Muhammad, really the moon god. 1,000 years before Muhammad was born, God was laying out these nations that are going to come. And you could see today, they're all there and they all hate Israel. So Libya is going to come, Iran's going to come, Ethiopia is going to come. Verse 6 says, Gomer with all of its troops, and Beth Targamah from the remote parts of the north with all of its troops, many peoples with you. Most Bible scholars, prophecy scholars agree that this is speaking of modern day Turkey. The people from the historic Cappadocia, which is modern day Turkey. Again, it also might include the area of modern day Armenia, some scholars believe. But interesting, Turkey was one of Israel's friends to some degree up until very recently. Turkey was probably the most progressive, secular country in the Middle East up until about 10 years ago. And with Erdogan coming into power, he's a Muslim dictator. He is turning the nation into an Islamic stronghold, and they are right there again, close in proximity to Israel, Turkey. Turkey is where the church was. Constantinople, Turkey was the headquarters of the church for almost 2,000 years for the Eastern Orthodox Church. For the first 500 years of the church, before it was Rome, it was Constantinople in Turkey. This is a Christian area. There's Christian churches and cathedrals that go back almost 2,000 years in modern day Turkey. And they were a friend to the West up until about 10 years ago. So you see all the players lined up now. That 20 years ago it would have been different. 50 years ago it would have been different. But today, all of these nations are opposed to the nation of Israel, primarily because of religious reasons, primarily because of Islam. Verse 7 says, "Be prepared and prepare yourself, you and all your companies that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days," verse 8, "you will be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste, but its people were brought out of the nations, and they are living securely." There's a whole bunch there in this one verse. After many days. Has it been after many days, Ezekiel? Oh yeah, it's been almost 2,000 years. That's many days. God's saying it's going to be not in your lifetime, Ezekiel. It's going to be in the future. Many days in the future. For God, a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. It's a little different for us as time moves. But it's going to be in the latter years. These armies are going to come into the land that has been restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations. Have the Jews been gathered from many nations into their homeland? Absolutely. From pretty much every nation on planet Earth, the Jews, Aliyah, have come back to their homeland. And they have dwelled in their homeland from nations all over the world. Not just nations in the Middle East, not speaking of the Babylonian captivity, one nation, or the Medo-Persian Empire, one empire. All over the world, the whole map. They're going to be restored from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Was Israel a continual waste? Yes, they were. I told you Mark Twain went over there, Samuel Clemens, in the 1800s, and he said, "I expected to see milk and honey, because the land flowing with milk and honey." And he says, "All I see are rocks and mountain goats, and as far as I could tell, the mountain goats must eat the rocks because there's no food for them to eat here." It was that bad. The Jews have planted millions of trees since they've come back into their homeland. They've dredged all the swamps. They have become one of the most prolific exporters of vegetables and fruits and flowers to Europe and really to the world, as God said would be the case. The people were brought out of the nations, and they are living securely. And again, is Israel secure? I feel it is one of the most secure, safest places on earth that you could ever find yourself. We're going to have to stop there. I apologize. Today was a little more of an introduction of the message. We'll just get right through it, and hopefully we'll get through the rest of Ezekiel 38 and 39 next Sunday.